So let's talk about this beautiful double welt pocket that can be a little bit intimidating. It doesn't have to be, though. I'm going to show you the way that I prefer to do this, and I'll explain why while we're in the process of doing it. But the process that I'm going to show you gives you a little wiggle room, relatively fail-proof process. Okay, so to begin, what we're going to do is look at these pattern pieces first. So we have a pocket self piece, which means it's going to be the part of the pocket bag that you see. It's usually done in the same fabric as the self of the garment, the body of the garment, because it does, become visible every once in a while. We have a lining piece on the other side, and that can also be the self fabric, but it depends on how light you want your jacket to be and the bulk that it's potentially adding. So one self piece, one lining piece, and two welts. And there are many, many ways of doing a welt pocket. This is just one of them by using separate welt pieces. You can actually do this entire setup with a single piece of fabric. And it's nice, but again, you're not going to have that ability to decrease your bulk and weight by using some different fabrics. So two separate welt pieces. We're also going to explain how to add a flap to this welt pocket. And it's a very easy step to add to your pocket. It's just right in the middle of or towards the end of the construction process. The only thing I would say about this, so with the pocket bag and welt patterns, it's all very direct, two-dimensional measurements, meaning that everything sews directly together. The flap has a turn of cloth. So the self of the flap, this outer side that we see, the good side, is a little bit bigger than our lining. And that's going to allow for this turn of cloth that you see when you turn it on the wrong side or the back side. So we're looking for about a 1/16 of an inch turn of cloth for that self fabric to wrap around and conceal this construction. It's the only piece that has a turn of cloth built into it. So all of these pieces are completely arbitrary. It depends on the fabric you're using, how accessible you want your pocket to be, where it is on the garment, what is going to be put in it. Is it a cell phone? Is it more than a cell phone? Does it need to have a really big pocket bag? This is a quite shallow pocket bag. You couldn't fit a cell phone in there for sure. So if I were doing this on a garment toward the waist of my garment, I would definitely make this a little bit bigger. It also depends on how much room you have. So if this were closer to the hem of the garment, we don't have a lot of room to work with, right? If the hem's right here, we can only go a little bit bigger before it starts to impede in the bottom of your jacket. The other thing you want to consider when you're patterning these is your fabric weight. If you are working with a fabric that is really thick, like a coating, you want to go with some slightly bigger welts. A 1/2 inch would be good. And the reason is, this fabric is going to fight you in one step of this process when you're trying to press back your seam allowances of your pocket opening. So a lot of fabrics, especially if you have some synthetics in this, maybe it's a wool synthetic blend or all synthetic, they can be a little resistant to pressing and steam. And the smaller this little seam allowance is, the harder it is to get it to push back, to convince it to go back where you want it to. So it's wise to go a little bit bigger for the depth of this. These right now are finishing at 1/4 of an inch, but I would go up to a 1/2 inch each for these, meaning your pocket opening is going to be a full inch in depth. So just consider that, the weight of your fabric. Is it a coating? Is it a jacketing? The sample material that we're going to use is much lighter. So this could be any number of garments, including a separates, a jacket, a pant, skirt, dress any of that. So you can already see how much lighter this is. It has a really nice drape to it. The weave is not very structured, so we've got a lot of give in this. We are always interfacing, stabilizing the back of our garment or project, whatever we are inserting a pocket into, especially something that you are cutting right into the fabric of. It's going to keep your yarns close together and not fray as much where you're cutting, and it's going to give it a little bit of structure and longevity for the wear of that garment. So it doesn't matter what pocket opening you're doing, you're always thinking about interfacing the different components and which components need interfacing and stabilizing. So for this sample, it's just a 2.5 inch depth by 7 inch length for our interfacing piece on the back of an 8 by 10 piece like this. I did position this interfacing a little bit towards the top because our setup is going to be not right in the center, so the pocket opening could be right in the center, but then that would push all of our pocket bag setup towards the bottom. So I went towards the top a little bit, including the flap that we're going to end up putting in there. So visually it will look centered when we're done by placing this little bit towards the top. So that's what you want to prepare for this. Prepare your sample piece that you're putting this into, cut out all of your pattern pieces, and also I like to go ahead and get this out of the way. Just go ahead and prep your pocket flap. And this is a construction, if you're not familiar with turn of cloth, then you can watch one of the other videos, the patch pocket video, and it shows you how to stitch something together that has a discrepancy in size. This flap has an 1/8 of an inch difference all the way around except for this top edge. That stays the same. Everything else around loses an 1/8 of an inch for the lining. To pattern this, like I was saying, you can pattern whatever size you want. This is going to be a 4 3/4 inch opening for our pocket, and your welt pieces, they are exactly that dimension, 4 3/4 across, if that were your opening, right? And the depth of the actual pattern piece, not talking about the seam allowance, is just double the width or depth of your welt pieces. So ours for the sample are finishing at 1/4 of an inch, so each one of these little sections is 1/4 of an inch, and then surrounded by 1/2 inch seam allowance on every other side. The lining and self finish in just that same way, so 4 3/4 across. But then if you imagine this welt piece as our opening, just like you see in this sample, this welt essentially is what you see right here, right? This self needs to line up to that top edge of the top welt, like that. And I'm talking about just the seam lines now, not the seam allowances, but I'm matching up my stitch lines. So the top of the top welt, and then the lining needs to match up with the bottom line of the bottom welt, because that's where they're going to stitch to and that's where they're going to live. So that's some easy pattern drafting right there. If this one lines up on the bottom welt, this one lines up on the top welt, and they match each other on the bottom, like so. The flap is a little bit weird when you stitch it together and you're losing that little bit of space. I patterned the self of this flap to be exactly that same 4 3/4, but if you think about it, your flap needs to be a little bit smaller, just an eyelash smaller than your actual opening, so it can fit in there without pushing things away or trying to scrunch up on itself to fit in there. But if we are stitching a lining that is smaller than the self, when we turn that piece right side out like this, it's going to lose half of whatever the difference is between those two pieces because it's bringing it around to the other side. So by 1/8 of an inch difference from our self to our lining, we've lost a 1/16 of an inch on the sides, which is perfect for fitting it right into that double welt. The other thing is it's hard to get, and depending on what fabric you're using, if it's a thicker fabric, you're going to lose more material when you turn your project right side out, and that turn of cloth to be able to travel around the corner, it's taking maybe a whole 1/8 of an inch off the sides. So it's sort of good to always do a sample, but the other thing you can do is construct your flap first, measure it, and you should have steamed and pressed your fabric always to try to pre-shrink it, definitely, because wool likes to shrink, right? So pre-shrink it, don't wash it in the washer or dryer because that's heat and friction that can do some weird things to wool, but try to press it and pre-shrink it. So then when you construct this flap, you can get a very clear read of what you're working with. So right now I'm 1/8 of an inch shorter than what our pocket opening is, which that's exactly what I intended and what I wanted. So good idea to measure this first and then just make a slight adjustment to your opening. If this turned out a little bit shorter, then just make your pocket opening a tiny bit shorter when you're applying it to the garment or the body of your project. And that way your flap can fit in there perfectly. So let's get started. This is the sample that we are going to be putting our welts into right now. And what I've done is I found my positioning right in the center of this interfacing just by eyeballing the center, putting a pin through the back toward the front. So I knew about where the center of the interfacing was as far as depth wise. So I could put a horizontal line in my project. I took a water soluble marking tool. You can use chalk if it's really sharp. Make sure to sharpen it with your scissors. Take any sharp metal edge and scrape it off until it's sharp enough to get a very precise line. And you're going to give yourself a very level horizontal line and exactly the measurement that you need, starting and stopping point right here. All I need at this point is this center line. I don't really need to draw in the rest of my pocket opening because if I'm stitching correctly, it's going to end up doing that for me anyway. And that will probably make sense in a second when we start. So starting and stopping points, the first step that you are going to do is stitch your welts onto the face of your project after you mark this, obviously. And again, these are our 2 welt pieces. What I've done with this is interface the welts, and this is determined by your fabrication too. So we have sample fabric, but it is different than the welts that we want. So the welts are a little bit more flimsy than our self fabric, a little bit lighter, a little more drapier. So I ended up just interfacing these welts so it could stand up against this self fabric better. I don't want these to be really wimpy, so that's why I did that. Maybe think and test your fabric out, see the difference of the weight, the drape of it, and try to imagine this fabric standing up to this fabric once you start sewing it together. So we have 2 interfaced welts right here. I'm going to place 1 welt good to good on the sample, and I'm trying to center it around my start and stopping points, and I'm lining up one of the raw edges right up on that line, that horizontal line. This is the center of our pocket opening, and I'm going to just pin in place. It's helpful if you use these pins to tell yourself where the starting and stopping points are. And I'm just going to take it to the machine. I'm going to make sure I'm stitching with a very short SPI, stitch per length. So if you're working on a machine like an industrial, I'm going to turn mine all the way down to 1 when I'm stitching this line. And I'm going to back tack on both sides, and I'm even going to hand walk the position of my needle and use the reverse pedal to get exactly where I want to make my needle enter where it needs to be exactly where my start and stop points are. So one welt stitched on, second one goes on this same exact way. You're basically butting up the welt, good to good with your sample. You're going to get that same placement. So our stitch right here tells us where our start and stop point are. We don't really need that mark in there anymore. We can tell by this. So I'm going to pin this in just like we did the first one. And here's the thing. I did not mention that it's a really good tip to mark from the edge exactly how far away you need to be stitching. Not only does it help you keep your stitch in a straight line, but because your panel is covering up your sewing foot plate, then you can't see your measurements. So you need to know exactly where your 1/4 inch width is. So after you pin it, use your same marking tool, and again, it needs to be really, really precise. So something like this water-soluble pen is really great. And when you make this next stitch, it's super imperative that you are getting not only parallel with it all the way across, but you start and stop directly below these start and stop points, because these 2 stitches determine the shape and size of your pocket opening. So that's going to mean how parallel it is, if it's skewed, if one side tapers to be smaller. You want it to be as perfect as you can get it. And I'm going to draw on this 1/4 inch for this side. All right, I'm going to stitch this exactly the same as this first one. At this point, we're going to cut open our project. This can be the scary part, because after this, you can't undo anything. Once you cut into the body of your garment, no going back. So it's easiest to do this from the back side because we have this nice white interfacing and we can see our marks really well. We're going to cut directly on that first initial horizontal line, right? The very center line between the 2 welts. So I'm going to draw a line almost from the 2 edges. And you can do this with a water-soluble pen or a regular pen, because this part does not show at all. This pen's not very good for this, but use some sort of marking tool. And I'm not going to the ends here because this is important for the construction of a welt. Everybody knows that has done a welt before that you have to cut these triangles at the end here. Anytime you are creating a cutout shape that is faced in a project, doesn't matter if it's a rectangle or a weird parallelogram, any corner or angle that shape has, when you stitch a piece good to the face of your project and flip it towards inside, to release it, to flip it towards inside, it has to have a clip towards any angle that needs to be made. And for ours, we need an angle that's going right to the corner of our stitch. And for this, you need to be exactly where your stitch is. So we need to go right there. The rule of thumb is that you want this triangle to be at least as wide as the depth of this opening. So you would shoot for about a 1/2 inch triangle here. The bigger your triangles are, the easier it is to manipulate this in an upcoming step, which determines your perpendicular angles, your 90-degree angles of this rectangle. I like to go a little bit further than a 1/2 inch, just so we have a little more to grab onto and to sew down. So something like this, being very careful that we are going right to our stitch end points and not past it. Same with our cutting. So now at this point we can cut this. The easiest way to start this is to fold this in half. And I'm going to make one clip right in the center to get through all of the material. I don't want to necessarily clip any of this, any of my welts, because that's already separated anyway. It doesn't need to be clipped. So I'm trying to just clip into this body of fabric to release our opening. So I'm going to clip all the way to that triangle point, and then I'm going to travel along those little legs. Now, I am getting this out of the way. I don't want to clip into my welt right here. So I'm just going to hold this out of the way while I clip this very carefully. If you need to, grab some smaller snips at this point because you're getting so very close to your stitch here, and as close as you can get is what you're aiming for without surpassing your stitch. So this determines how well and how cleanly your project is pushed toward the inside. Now I'll get that other welt out of the way. Okay, so fully released, right? This is what it should look like. Now we're going to take this to the ironing board. Here's the thing with this. Remember what we were talking about, thicker fabrics. This is the seam allowance that I'm talking about. If you have a really thick fabric, like this coating, and you're trying to manipulate and work with a seam allowance this small, it's going to fight you to the very last minute. You're going to need to apply a lot of pressure. I mean, this is if you are trying to get a 1/4 inch, which I would not suggest this, a 1/4 inch welt for something so thick. One, it's not going to look very good because it's going to just be this tiny little bubbly welt that doesn't even lay flat. When you get a bigger opening, each welt being 1/2 inch rather than a 1/4 inch, then you're going to have more seam allowance to work with, and you're going to have more amount of space for that fabric to lay flat and look nice. So this is that seam allowance that I'm talking about, the pocket opening seam allowance, these little guys. Take your project to the ironing board and press your welts up like this to start the process. We want this to be a nice crisp line, so give it a press. Keep in mind what fibers you're working with your fabric. Do you need to change your setting? Do you need to use a press cloth? You should always be using a press cloth, actually. So first step, press these upward. Now it looks like this, pressed upward, right? So now our seam that we just made, our seam lines are really crisp. Now you can turn this project toward the interior, or turn your welts into the interior of your project, and you're going to press again. Here's where that seam allowance will fight you. If it's too thick of a material and too small of a seam allowance, you need this seam allowance to go up like this without the welt. Use a lot of steam, not too much so it's hurting your project and undoing the glue of your interfacing, but use an appropriate amount of steam, a little bit of steam to set it and open up the fibers, but then also, especially if you're working with a real wool, 100% wool, use a clapper or a piece of wood or something that is a little bit heavy, like a pressing ham. It will absorb the heat. This is a clapper, right? So when you're setting it on stuff, after you've pressed it, it's all nice and hot and it still has steam in there. When you put this pressure on it, it not only keeps it in that place while it cools, but it takes the heat away from it. So this is pressed in place now. And I find it really helpful to look at it from the good side of your project and make sure your seam allowances are pressed away like we were just talking about. But you can allow your welt piece to just live flat, lay where it wants to be flat, while that seam allowance, I can feel it under here, while that seam allowance is pressed back on itself. And that will help you get a nice crisp line right here. So I did that for both sides. Now you want to position these welts in place. And you're going to fold these to meet each other perfectly in the center. You can even pin them again right on the sides here, just to help it remember where you would like them to stay. Now this is what I was talking about at the beginning. There are some methods of putting in a welt that pre-fold the welts like this. Let's say this was our welt, right? Same size as this one, but all that happened was it was pressed beforehand in half. This would be the little edge of the welt, and you would stitch this down like this with your beginning stitch. Then when you turn them in, that fold is already there, that other side is already set in place, but that is a pro and a con. Yes, you don't have to secure that other side that's unfolded, but now you have no room to readjust the widths of your welt, because we have the capability now of perfectly adjusting as many times as we want until we're happy with it. And that's the beauty of this method. And I'm going to take it to the iron so it helps me figure out where these need to be, and then check it from the front, see how they're meeting. If there's any gaping, if there's any overlapping, go to the back again, fix it a little bit, and then press it really good so it all stays in place. Okay, I'm fairly happy with that. We still need to do a couple of things to make this as perfect as we can get it. I'm going to baste these two welts together right down the center line. This is another step in which we can correct any gaping, like a little bit of gaping here. This top one is a little bit bigger than this lower one right here. I can sort of counter that with my basting stitches. And I'm going to press it one more time while it's basted in place like this, so it's perfect and just really steamed in there together nicely. With your project facing upward, you're going to fold back one side at a time and gently give a tug to this. I'm barely pulling on it. I just want to make sure it's fully extended. Check to see what it looks like on that front, and let these welts behind here meet exactly together. This should be an extension of what's happening in the opening of your pocket. They should be meeting perfectly. And what I want to do is stitch this triangle down using a small stitch again. All I'm going to do is stitch as close as I can get to my project without going into my project. I'm going to do a little line right across this triangle, catching those welts underneath. back tack on start and stop. So this is what it should look like. A little stitch right on that triangle and as close as I could get to the project. If you have your project folded back and it's parallel with itself like this, if you're on grain, if you're perpendicular to the opening of your pocket, that will give you a guideline for a straight edge across this short edge of your pocket opening. Okay, I went ahead and did the other side. You're just going to do it the same way. Project up, fold back the other side, stitch as close as you can get. Now we're also going to do this seam allowance, because remember, our folded back edge, we have it sort of locked down with these triangles, right? We've included this top and bottom seam welt in our seam allowance stitch of that triangle, but you want to give it some extra security. So what you're going to do, and we have not taken out our basting stitch yet, we want to keep this in, because when you start to pull back this project, my interfacing is starting to stick to itself. That means that the adhesive is coming through to the other side. So when you start messing with your project like this, and these tiny little seam allowances that are quite a bit of bulk in that little bitty space, that can be a pretty bossy area. So when you start folding this back and trying to get it to talk to this welt piece, that can adjust your welts on the front and the positioning of them and where they meet. So that's why you keep that basting stitch in while you do this step. We're going to do the same thing. You're going to stitch this tiny seam allowance of your pocket opening to this welt fabric back here. And you don't want to stitch inside of this original seam line that you have to create your pocket opening. We want to stitch just in that seam allowance. It doesn't even matter where. We're just locking in that position of our welt to that seam allowance. Okay, so stitch down this side and then lift up the bottom side. Do the same thing. You can change your stitch length to something longer now. You don't need to be as small with this. Did it on both sides. Now we can start messing with our pocket bag. The first thing that we're going to do is the lining piece. And this is the last step that we do before we take out our basting if we put in a flap. So we're going to do the lining before we put in the flap. And what I like to do with my pieces is first I place them in a way that I can read them. So I know that my pattern for myself, if I'm looking at the good side of it, my notch is down here, like this. My lining piece, since it faces the opposite way of my self piece, has that notch that should match up with it on the other side. So now I'm looking at myself and my lining, good sides facing upward. And then I like to position this piece in my project the way it's going to live. So if ultimately my lining piece is going to live in this project, good sides facing toward the wearer. So here's my good side of my lining facing towards the inside of my project. But I need this to stitch good to good with my seam allowance on my pocket opening. So I'm going to flip it good to good so we can stitch it down like this and then press it down like that. So consider what seam allowance you have. We have a 1/2 inch on this, which means that it's a 1/4 of an inch past what we have down here. So basically I'm trying to line up my raw edge of this lining about a 1/4 inch past this when I stitch it on. So how we're going to stitch this together is again by turning our project so we can access just the seam allowance of our pocket opening and the lining on the bottom. So now I'm going to do another stitch, and technically you could do that last step all in one if you wanted to throw that pocket bag lining under there while you did that stitch. That's totally fine. So I'm going to stitch this lining all the way across right in the seam allowance right here, making sure I don't pass into that original seam. And this is what it looks like. So I have it stitched on. I stitched it like this when I had the position of the lining, stitched it to my seam allowance, and then I ironed it down because that's how it's going to live. Pressed it with a nice pressing cloth so it didn't ruin my nice synthetic lining, right? And then here's where your construction process would differ. But if you are just doing a welt pocket, you would skip right to putting that pocket self on. But since we're going to demonstrate a flap in this, we're going to remove this basting stitch real quick. Ooh la la, new welt pocket. Okay, so wait, basting stitch is gone. So all we need to do is feed this into this welt opening that we made. Don't look yet, it's gonna be a surprise. Okay, so it doesn't look too bad so far. It might be a smidge. See how it's starting to buckle a little bit right here? It's pushing it. I actually would prefer that rather than it being too small, you know? And sometimes when people are putting flap into the welt pocket, they will do a single welt, just welt on the top, so they wouldn't have any welt on the bottom here. And in that case, they wouldn't risk having a welt that shows. If your welt was too small like this, then you would see that little edge there when you stitched it in, the edge of your bottom welt. That wouldn't look good. That's not cute. So I sort of prefer it being a little smidge too big rather than it being a smidge too small. And we're going to do the same thing. You can see how much this seam allowance, how much action it's seen. We're stitching a lot of stuff to it. It's pretty important. So once you get this in a position that you like, making sure that there's enough to catch the flap in this seam allowance, and determine how much of that flap you like to see, and then lock it into place. So I'm going to pin this down, and then I'm going to lift my project up like this and stitch the seam allowance of my flap to the seam allowance of my pocket opening. Once you have the flap secured and that seam allowance up there, all you have to do is put in the pocket bag self. So I wasn't recording when I did this last time, so I already put it in, but the self piece goes face upward, and you basically just line it up with the lining piece. It should match up at the top and the bottom, and you're going to stitch it down through all the layers, all the way at the top, around the side, bottom, back up the other side, making sure to back stitch. If you want to secure the corners at the bottom, you can do a little back tuck right there and right here to make those corners a little stronger. And that's it. You have a working double welt pocket with a flap, optional flap.